This is how to survive your Saturn return. So the motivation for this video was mostly selfish. I'm going through my Saturn return next year in April of 2026, and I'm nervous for it. It's one of the most important astrological transits that you go through. I mean, I've been waiting basically since I started practicing astrology 8 years ago for this moment. So I want to be prepared, especially because preparation is basically exactly what Saturn asks of you in a Saturn return. First, let's get the space set because I feel like this might be a long video. Oh my God, okay. Okay, we got our little candle lit now. So in this video, I'm going to explain what a Saturn return is and how you can figure out all of the astrological information that you need to know for your own Saturn return, as well as give examples of celebrities, political figures, CEOs who have gone through Saturn returns to try to give an actual concrete example of how Saturn shows up in every one of the houses. All right, so let's just start with what is a Saturn return. So a Saturn return just refers to the time when Saturn comes all the way back around to where it was at the time that you were born. A natal chart is basically just a map of the solar system taken exactly at the time that you were born. So Saturn was in some position, let's say it's 28 degrees Pisces at the time that you were born. And then Saturn keeps moving, it goes all the way around, and then eventually it makes it back to 28 degrees Pisces, approximately 27 to 30 years later. So Saturn takes around 30 years, a little under 30 years, to complete an entire cycle around the zodiac. And so in astrology, we think of a Saturn return, this moment when Saturn comes back to where it was, as being essentially a karmic test. Saturn is the father of karma, it's the father of time, it's kind of like the daddy of the zodiac. It's the quintessential malefic planet, which in ancient astrology or classical astrology was kind of the bad guy of the zodiac. I personally think Saturn is just very misunderstood. Yes, he is conservative and he demands a lot from you, but ultimately Saturn is trying to create the structures that will actually last in your life. And so wherever Saturn is in your chart, this is an area where you will feel that sort of father figure looking over your shoulder to make sure you're doing your homework. It's probably an area of your life where up until your Saturn return, you felt like there's a lot of pressure or things don't come easily to you. And then once the Saturn return actually happens between the ages of 27 to 30, that's when you get the sort of final exam, the test of that area of your life. So the area of life where you feel the effects of the Saturn return and Saturn in general is going to be the house that Saturn is in. So you really need to know what house Saturn is in order to understand how your Saturn return is actually going to show up. So this is just astro.com that I have here. So basically you would just put in your info. Let's say my name's Dan. I'm a guy. I was born on January 1st, 1990 at 4 a.m. in, let's say, New York. This will usually give you a pop-up. Say New York, New York. Okay, so I will put in all of my information here, and it's important that you actually know the time here. A lot of people just have an estimate. That's okay within an hour or two, but in order to really know precisely where Saturn is going to show up and how it's going to aspect other planets in your chart, you really want to know the exact time as much as possible. So let's assume that Dan was born at 4 a.m. and he knows that for sure, and he's put in all his information about the time and place of birth. So then you hit continue and astro.com will draw up this chart. So this is a natal chart. If you're unfamiliar with a natal chart, it's basically just a map of the solar system at the time that you were born with Earth at the center. And then all of the symbols out here are the planets. So if you use the key over here, you'll see that Saturn is this symbol. And so we'll look for Saturn. We see it down here. So this is Saturn and it's in the second house. So these black lines that have all the numbers, these are the houses. And then whichever planets are contained within the black lines of that number, those are the planets that are in that house. So in this case, Dan has quite a few planets in Capricorn, that's this symbol here, and also in the second house. So I definitely recommend drawing up your natal chart and figuring out what house Saturn is in before you deep dive into Saturn return stuff, just because it's going to make the interpretations a lot more specific. The other thing that you're going to want to do is you're probably going to want to go and figure out when your Saturn return is actually happening. And the easiest way to do this is to go to a website that will actually give you a calculation of your Saturn return. I like AstroSeek. I think AstroSeek does a good job. So we can put in the same information here. What was Dan's birthday? Okay, let's say it's January 1st, 1990, 4 a.m. in New York. And let's say that he still lives in New York. We will calculate his return. So this will then give you a table of the exact dates of your Saturn return. So he went through his first Saturn return in 2019. you'll see there's multiple dates here. We'll get into that a lot, especially with the examples. Not everyone has multiple peaks in their Saturn return. The reason why you might only have one Saturn return date or 3 Saturn return dates is because the planets are going retrograde all the time. So if you imagine, sometimes a planet will just pass a specific point and keep going, but sometimes it'll pass and then it'll retrograde and then it'll pass again. And so oftentimes you'll get a Saturn return that has 3 peaks, which is just the first peak, the retrograde peak, and then the final pass. These are essentially all peak moments. I would say the major difference between the 3 moments is that the first peak is obviously the first initiation of the energy. The second retrograde peak is sort of a reworking of the energy. And then the third is the grand finale. But generally speaking, this often causes Saturn returns to last for periods of months or up to a year in total. So now that you have the house that Saturn is in, and you also have the time when your Saturn return will happen, you have all the information that you need to go off and investigate your Saturn return. I do also want to make a note on the sign that Saturn is in. Everyone always asks me like, what about Saturn in Aries? What about Saturn in Pisces? Give me your interpretation. The sign that Saturn is in does affect the mood, the vibe, the kind of general energy that Saturn has as it goes about your Saturn return, but it's not the major influence. And the reason for this is that Saturn spends around 2.5 years in a sign. So anyone that was born in the Saturn in Aries or Saturn in Pisces or whatever era with you is going to have the same Saturn sign. It certainly does have an effect on the way that Saturn plays out, but it's just not as important for someone as an individual as the house that Saturn is in. Just to give a couple examples of how Saturn in a different sign would affect the energy, for Saturn in Pisces, which these people have just finished up their Saturn return or are just finishing it up now, there might be a little bit more emphasis on boundaries, delusions, addiction, all of the things that Pisces struggles with. For Saturn in Aries, which shout out Saturn in Aries, I'm also Saturn in Aries, we're going through our Saturn return over the next 2.5 to 3 years. Saturn in Aries has a little bit more of a flavor about going your own way, not being impulsive, learning how to do things on your own. All the things that Aries kind of wants to do or struggles with. And then Saturn in Taurus, which is the next generation after me, this Saturn return probably has a little bit more of a flavor around stability, trying to find true value, and maybe a material or financial angle. But again, the important thing here really is the house that Saturn is in. So I'll put in a diagram of some kind with the houses so that you can see what area of life your Saturn return is showing up in. But let's say that it's the 10th house. That would be a Saturn return in your career or destiny realm. So you'll have tests relating to your career, your work, or what it is that you're here to do. Let's say it's the 6th house. This might be daily routine, maintenance of health, day-to-day life, coworkers. As I said, wherever Saturn is in your chart, whatever house, this is where you're going to feel that father figure looking over your shoulder, making sure that you're actually doing everything, making sure that you're doing the hard work and checking all the boxes as you go. Okay, so now that we've gotten through the basics and intro of what a Saturn return is, I'm going to start going through examples of Saturn returns in every single house of the zodiac. As I said, this video was selfishly motivated. I wanted to do this for my own personal research, and it was really interesting for me to go through all of these Saturn returns and see what they had in common or what people did differently that resulted in them having a better time of it, basically. Most of these Saturn returns ended up successful in the sense that the person leveled up at the end. Not all of them, but most. The major difference was basically how much someone suffered or struggled through their Saturn return. I think a key thing with Saturn is you can't really fight it. You sort of just have to lean in and work hard and work through it. So let's start going through the houses. So for my example, for a first house Saturn return, I have Lana Del Rey. Lana went through her Saturn return in the first house, basically all throughout 2014. She had 3 separate peaks in her Saturn return. The first house rules self-identity, public image, body, and self-reinvention. In 2014, Lana Del Rey released her album Ultraviolence. Ultraviolence was her second major album, and it has a much rawer, darker feel than Born to Die, her breakout album. Ultraviolence is kind of a fan favorite album because it has such intense lyrical content, and it really is just such a dark, feminine vibe. But for those of us who were fans of Lana when this came out, I'm sure we remember how controversial this album was at the time. There were a lot of lyrics about abusive relationships and being a submissive woman. He hit me and it felt like a kiss, that type of stuff, that sparked a huge backlash. Critics essentially called her anti-feminist. They accused her of romanticizing violence. She was under a lot of scrutiny at that time. So let's think about how this relates to her first house Saturn return, right? This is Saturn coming around and testing her as it relates to her public image. During her Saturn return, she gave a lot of difficult interviews, let's say. She said things like, "For me, the issue of feminism is just not an interesting concept." She talked about how she was more interested in futuristic ideas rather than feminism. At the same time, she was performing at Coachella and extremely famous. And as I said, Ultraviolence is a fan favorite album. It was really loved by true Lana fans. But ultimately, it was a big departure from her public identity that she had had with Born to Die. Born to Die suggested that she was going to be this kind of hip-hop pop diva. Ultraviolence was dark and indie and ultimately pretty transgressive for someone who was in the public eye the way that Lana was. And I think if you look at her career now, you know, she's living in Alabama with her alligator husband or whatever. She's definitely changed her relationship to her public identity, to her fame. And I think a lot of it really started with Ultraviolence and the backlash. So ultimately, the first house Saturn return that Lana went through, I'm sure it was painful and difficult at the time, right? It's never a good feeling to get a lot of media scrutiny or to have your art judged so harshly, especially as it relates to your identity. But I think ultimately the lesson that Saturn was trying to teach her was to own her artistic integrity, to own her identity, her true self-image, which was this kind of dark femme fatale character. So I would call this ultimately a successful Saturn return, but it's not an easy one. All right, let's move on to the second house Saturn return. So my example for the second house Saturn return is Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor is an icon. She's a golden age of Hollywood actress, and she was one of the best paid actresses of all time at her time. The second house rules money, material, finances, just anything that has to do with your relationship to the material world. So generally speaking, when I see a second house Saturn return, I usually assume that has something to do with money or worldly possessions or just your relationship to your finances and money in general. If you know about Elizabeth Taylor, you know that she was known for being opulent. She had her second house Saturn return in 1962 when she was filming the movie Cleopatra. She was the title character of Cleopatra and she was paid $1 million for the role, which actually made her the first movie star in history to be paid that much for a role. And she was also set to receive 10% of the profits of the film. You might think, okay, great, that's a super easy second house Saturn return. What's the catch, right? She got $1 million for her role in Cleopatra plus a percentage of the profits from the movie. Seems like not a bad deal, right? Unfortunately, the film's production ended up costing way more than expected. There were extravagant costuming and sets. Elizabeth Taylor actually contracted almost fatal pneumonia, and so filming was delayed as well. Cleopatra ended up being the most expensive film ever made at the time. It cost $62 million to make, and the movie took years to recoup its costs. Fox, its producer, actually almost went bankrupt because of this movie. And they actually publicly blamed Elizabeth Taylor and her co-star Richard Burton for this. They tried to sue the two of them for damages, claiming that the extramarital affair they had had on set ruined the film's prospects of success. This lawsuit ultimately was not successful. And so despite getting paid so well for Cleopatra, Elizabeth Taylor actually refers to this as a low point in her career. And I think this is a really great example of a Saturn return in general because it really shows how Saturn tests you, but it also forces you to transform into the person that you're supposed to be. Her relationship with Richard Burton ultimately led to them starring in 11 films together. They were known for their scandalous, opulent, over-the-top romance, and the films that they were in together ultimately were just trying to capitalize off of the immense media attention that the two of them got, which started with Cleopatra. And this sort of scandalous romantic life is ultimately what Elizabeth Taylor, in a lot of ways, was known for. She was married 8 times throughout her life, twice to Richard Burton. And it kind of solidified this sort of opulent, over-the-top identity that we associate with her now. Interestingly, during her second Saturn return, which happens between the ages of 56 to 60, she launched her billion-dollar fragrance White Diamond. So she actually became a billionaire under her second Saturn return. So this is obviously a great example of a successful Saturn return, but it still sucked in the moment. Like Cleopatra was a low point for Elizabeth Taylor. That was not a good experience for her. But it transformed her into the person that she needed to be, and it created this identity for her, especially around money and finances, that led her into the rest of her career. Let's continue on with a third house Saturn return, and my example for this one is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates actually went through their Saturn returns within 1 year of each other, and it was right at the peak of the Apple versus Microsoft clash for dominance of computing. I'll talk more about Bill Gates' Saturn return when we get to the fifth house because he's my example for that house, but I feel like it really is just such a great example of how momentous a Saturn return is. I mean, these two men's Saturn returns basically defined an entire era of personal computing. And for both of them, it was a very pivotal moment, but it played out very differently for the two of them. So Steve Jobs was actually ousted from Apple during his third house Saturn return. The third house deals with communications, connections, and the way that social dynamics from our siblings or early childhood dynamics form the foundation for our communication style. Steve Jobs had his Saturn return at the end of 1984. This was an incredibly tumultuous time in his career. He started out 1984 really strong. This is when Apple launched their iconic 1984 Macintosh Super Bowl ad, where they basically depict IBM as this evil authoritarian 1984 figure, and Apple being this revolutionary that changes everything.
Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
This ad campaign showed what a powerhouse Steve Jobs was with communication and marketing. It was an extremely popular ad and it led to a ton of sales of Macintosh. But ultimately, the product was not there. The Macintosh computer was really not that great. And so sales declined rapidly, and Apple ended up ousting Steve Jobs from his leadership position due to the failed campaign. However, he did not stop there. After he was ousted from Apple, he founded Next Computer, and this is where he really focused and honed his minimalist hardware design that he's known for now. He also co-founded Pixar around this time, which I think also adds to the narrative of communication through storytelling. Pixar, before getting involved with Steve Jobs, was essentially just a digital animation wing of a different production company, and Steve Jobs bought it, and then he told them to focus on the storytelling aspects of what they were doing. So again, working very hard on communicating and connecting concepts. So when you view his Saturn return in isolation, not knowing the context of how he would be known later, his Saturn return seems like a total failure. He was ousted from his own company even after he had a major communication success, and he basically had to claw his way back with Next Computer and Pixar. But I think the important thing here is that it forced him to hone his vision. He had to actually work on what were the important aspects of communication and connection that he needed to build, both externally to the public as well as internally to his colleagues. In 1996, over a decade later, he actually returned to Apple with all of his work from Next Computer, and the work that he had done at Next Computer ended up becoming the iconic Mac operating system, which is the user interface that we most associate with Steve Jobs' legacy. So yes, this sucked. I'm sure it was not a great time to go through, but you can kind of think of a Saturn return as sort of being like this refining process where you might not know why things are happening, why things aren't going the way that you want them to, why you're being tested so hard even when you're trying really hard. But then after the fact, with context, you can look back on it and sort of see how it makes you into a much more refined version of the person that you were before. All right, next Saturn return, we have the fourth house, which is the house of home, roots, and family. And our example for this is Drake. This is a really solid example of a fourth house Saturn return. I mean, this is like quintessential fourth house. So as I said, fourth house has to do with home, roots, and heritage. So for Drake, this is Toronto, the city that he came up in, the city that he talks about in so much of his work. And during his Saturn return, he basically doubled down on his commitment to his hometown, and he wrote an album that's ultimately kind of like a love letter to Toronto. During his Saturn return, which was in late 2015, he was writing Views, which is an album all about Toronto and his reflections on fame. It's filled with references to places within the city of Toronto. The lyrical content is full of nostalgia, isolation, and reflections on how the city shaped him ultimately as a person. These are quintessential fourth house Saturn return themes. It's about reckoning with where you come from and deciding what home means to you now. And beyond the music, he was literally building a home at this time. He purchased a plot in an upscale Toronto neighborhood in fall of 2015, and then he spent the next several years building a mega mansion in Toronto. He described the project as demonstrating his desire to stay forever solid in the place he was born. As I said, this is like the most literal version of a fourth house Saturn return I could imagine. I mean, he literally built a physical construction that mirrored the inner construction that Saturn was pushing him towards. So Drake's fourth house Saturn return was about more than just building a house or hometown pride. It was about kind of owning his roots and anchoring his identity within Toronto and his hometown in general. Views, the album, is sort of the artistic artistic culmination of the emotional content, whereas the house that he was building is the physical manifestation. So Drake's Saturn Return was melancholic and nostalgic, but it was ultimately a pretty successful era for him. And I think it's because he really did a fourth house Saturn return pretty much perfectly by the books. Drake's Saturn return was, melancholic and nostalgic, but it was ultimately a successful era for him because he put in the work to solidify the foundations of his home. All right, moving on to the fifth house, we have Bill Gates, who I talked about before in the third house Saturn return example of Steve Jobs. Bill Gates is a really great example of how to win your Saturn return. I'm not sure if his Saturn return was easy or hard for him personally, but from the outside, it was a total success. The fifth house is about creativity, self-expression, and risk-taking. And during Bill Gates' fifth house Saturn return in 1985, he learned how to balance his creative instinct with a conservative approach to his business. During Bill Gates' Saturn return, he made one of the most important creative gambles of his career. He released Windows 1.0 in November 1985. And this, compared to the Apple Macintosh ad of 1984, was not a runaway initial success, but it was a strategic first step as far as the actual technical components went. And this move was essentially a long-term play that would end up dominating the entire market. At this time, he was also tightening his control over the board at Microsoft. He was negotiating with IBM and Apple, who were these adversarial forces against Microsoft as well as against each other, in order to see how Microsoft could work with these companies and kind of wedge themselves in an important way. So I think his Saturn return does a good job of reflecting the fifth house themes, where he's being creative, he's taking risks, but he's doing it while staying firmly in control. This is in contrast to Steve Jobs' 1984 Macintosh launch, which was his Saturn return. Jobs' Macintosh launch was all about frills, right? It was flashy, it was risky, and ultimately it was a failure. Whereas Gates went about his Saturn return by delivering a really solid project, figuring out collaborations, maintaining control of his company. It was much more of a conservative but deeply strategic approach, compared especially to Steve Jobs. And so he was able to combine his vision with pragmatism and build a foundation for his company's dominance. It's hard for me to know what was actually going on with Bill Gates personally at this time, right? It's entirely possible that he found this time of his life to be super miserable and difficult, and like he was going through the kind of quintessential Saturn return test. But ultimately, from the outside, this was a major success, right? I think this is a really important Saturn return to study if you're interested in understanding how to win your Saturn return. His Saturn return was about emphasis on hard work and ultimately what was kind of a conservative approach. And this is exactly what Saturn wants, right? Saturn is this pragmatic, conservative father figure. Saturn wants you to put in the work even when no one's watching. Saturn doesn't care about your flashy Super Bowl ad, right? Saturn wants you to show up every single day and make the behind the scenes moves that are ultimately going to lead to long-term success. So yeah, Bill Gates, fifth house Saturn return, really good example of a positive Saturn return, at least externally. And I think with all these examples, you're starting to get a picture of what kind of behaviors Saturn likes and what behaviors Saturn does not reward. All right, let's move on to the sixth house Saturn return example, which is the Weeknd. The sixth house rules health, daily habits, discipline, and work. I would say the sixth house is kind of all of the boring stuff. It's like the day-to-day routine maintenance things that you have to do to stay healthy, to stay on top of your tasks, to make sure that you don't fall off, basically. So a Saturn return in the sixth house is basically just a test of those sort of day-to-day habits, routines, and your discipline. The Weeknd went through his sixth house Saturn return at the end of 2019. And I think at this time, you really see the separation from himself as Abel and the self-destructive persona of the Weeknd. So much of the Weeknd's artistic persona is focused on unhealthy habits. It's focused on drug use and partying. During his Saturn return in 2019, he was working on the album After Hours. I think the lyrical content of that album really reflects the way that he was reconciling with those behaviors. He talks about being sober for a period of time. He talks about potentially overdosing. If you're familiar with that album, you know it feels like a struggle between the party boy and the boy who wants to be better. The Weeknd doesn't do a ton of interviews, but I found a GQ interview from 2021 after his Saturn return, which asked him about drugs and partying. And he talks about how he's spent the last few years thankful that it was easy for him to give it up. He specifically says he gave up things like heavy drinking and drugs, and that as he developed as an artist, he realized he needed separation from his work persona as The Weeknd and his home persona as Abel. I'm a fan of The Weeknd, and I find that with him, it's very difficult to tell what of his artistic output is persona and what of it is true to his actual reality. And it sounds like during this time, that separation between those two people, the sort of character of The Weeknd and the person of Abel, was made a lot more concrete for him. And this is literally what the sixth house is about, right? It's about the boring stuff, the routines, the setting boundaries, the daily healthy habits that maintain the work. The Weeknd's sixth house Saturn return was essentially about drawing a line between the destructive excess of The Weeknd and the healthier, more sustainable identity of Abel Tesfaye. Moving on, let's go to the seventh house Saturn return, and the example we have for this is Martha Stewart. This one is a tough one. This one is not really a great Saturn return, although it ultimately sort of worked out for her in the end. The seventh house rules marriage, long-term partnerships, and one-on-one relationships. Basically, any time that it's a partnership dynamic where it's you and another person, this could be a business partnership or a romantic or a friendship, that's the seventh house. So it can be a difficult house to have your Saturn return in because obviously no one wants a difficult test in their personal, close, loving relationships. But unfortunately, this was Martha Stewart's cross to bear. Martha Stewart had her seventh house Saturn return in May 1971. Saturn in the seventh house brings commitment and responsibility in relationships, but it also forces you to confront the cracks in your close relationships. Just 1 month before her exact Saturn return, Martha and her then husband Andrew purchased the Turkey Hill farmhouse in Westport, Connecticut. This was the house that became the home base for the Martha Stewart empire. This was the testing ground for her recipes, her gardening brand, all of her lifestyle content. I mean, Martha Stewart in a lot of ways was sort of the first lifestyle influencer. But while the Turkey Hill farmhouse built her career, it broke their marriage. Both she and Andrew were unfaithful during this time. And she's publicly admitted that although the house was wonderful for her work, it was not great for their relationship. This huge commitment that she made that ultimately set the stage for her professional empire also exposed the fractures in her very close one-on-one personal relationship. And again, this is exactly what a seventh house Saturn return does. It tests the foundations of a partnership. And sometimes that makes the commitments deepen, but sometimes it makes them fall apart. If I have to categorize this in terms of successful and unsuccessful, I mean, Martha Stewart does not seem like she's had a super successful love life after the fact, but she has been a very successful businesswoman and continues to be so. I think it's a pretty quintessential example of a seventh house Saturn return, even though it's a negative one. All right, if you thought that one was bad, now we're on to the eighth house Saturn return, and our example here is Khloe Kardashian. So Lamar Odom was basically Khloe's Saturn return. And I'm so sorry for you eighth housers that this is your example because this is easily the worst one in the whole bunch. But the eighth house is very difficult. I mean, even when I was trying to look for positive eighth house Saturn returns, it's kind of tricky because it's a very personal house. So it's not always something that you can tell about a celebrity unless it's a Kardashian who shares their entire life. And then it's easy to sort of put together a timeline and figure out what happened during their eighth house Saturn return. The eighth house rules intimacy, shared resources, transformation, crisis, and all things taboo. I often explain the eighth house as being the things that we don't like to talk about. So, imagine you're at a dinner party with a mix of friends and family. What are the topics that would be uncomfortable if they came up? Usually money, or the way that money affects the power dynamics in a relationship, sex, addiction, inheritances, all these kind of things that we just don't want to talk about with people because they create weird power dynamics. That's the eighth house. And so for those of you who are familiar with Khloe and Lamar's marriage, I think this will be very obvious how this played out. Khloe went through her Saturn return in 2013, January to September of 2013. And all throughout 2013, there were reports surfacing of Lamar's drug use and multiple affairs. Khloe and Lamar were a married couple. They had a spin-off show of the Kardashians together. Their relationship was very public. And so during this whole time, basically, she was defending him and saying, no, he wasn't doing these things. No, it's not true. She put on a face of unity and a happy home for the public. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, things were clearly a mess. And it wasn't until August of 2013, which was right around the end of her Saturn return, that he was arrested for a DUI. And Khloe has admitted that this was the point that she actually started uncovering the full extent of his affairs and drug use. At the end of her Saturn return in December of 2013, Khloe officially filed for divorce from Lamar. This was certainly not the end of her saga with Lamar, but it was a recognition of the taboo topic of infidelity and addiction in her marriage. This story is honestly so sad to me, and I also feel like you can see the ways that Khloe has not learned her lesson in the relationships that she has after Lamar. The 8th house does not fuck around. It's a very dark energy. Chloe was essentially entangled in Lamar's cycle of crisis for years, even after the romantic side of their relationship had ended. And that's really what the 8th house is about. It's about these power dynamics that emerge from the intricacies in close relationships and the ways that we don't want to address that, especially with those close relationships. Khloe Kardashian's Saturn return in the 8th house forced her to confront the betrayal that she was experiencing in her marriage. And ideally, on the other side of that, you learn a lesson and you become more real with yourself. Anyway, let's move on to the 9th house Saturn return. Our example here is Charli XCX. So Charli XCX went through her Saturn return in February of 2022. The 9th house rules beliefs, philosophy, worldview, and kind of the way that you broadcast your ideas to the wider world. Saturn in the 9th house forces you to reassess your big picture perspective and kind of take responsibility for your values and your choices. Charli's Saturn return was kind of a crash out. And I mean that literally too. This was when she released her album Crash, which was a good album, at least in my opinion, but it was a departure from the hyperpop sound that she had sort of developed a cult following for. And it was a bit of a disappointment for her fans who really believed in that sound from her. I'm gonna actually just put a screenshot of a Reddit comment by poster Cred2s that I think actually does a really good job of explaining this era of her career. You know, on the one hand, she has her record label that wants her to make music like Fancy and Boom Clap and I Love It, which were these charting singles that got a ton of mainstream success. And then on the other hand, her diehard fans wanted more of this A.G. Cook hyperpop sound. And so right as her Saturn return peaked in February 2022, Charli actually stepped back from social media and she posted that she was having a difficult time with balancing basically all these opinions of her. You can really feel the difficulty that she had at this time with balancing her artistic integrity and vision with commercial validation. I mean, Charli's a Leo at the end of the day, like she wants that fame and recognition. She wants those #1 hits, right? But at the same time, she was developing a sound that was really cool and really interesting to her artistically. And so I think this moment kind of forced her to reassess her perspective on fame and question what it meant to be an artist in a world of constant online scrutiny. And this really set her up for the success that she then experienced a couple years later with Brat. Brat was both authentic to her hyperpop artistic vision as well as being massively commercially successful. So I think the lessons that she learned at the time of her Saturn return in 2022 ultimately led to her being able to stick to her artistic vision, to stick to her worldview, and still find success in communicating that to a wider audience. So if I have to assess this on success or not success, you know, it's ultimately successful in the sense that she did get success in this realm of her life later, but it did seem like a very difficult time in her career. Pretty consistent with a lot of the Saturn returns we've seen, right? It's a struggle, but on the other side, you're a better person. All right, let's continue on to the 10th house. And our example here is Leonardo DiCaprio. Leonardo DiCaprio's 10th house Saturn return was the moment when he went from teen heartthrob to serious Hollywood power player. Leo had his 10th house Saturn return in 2004. The 10th house rules career, public image, legacy, and destiny. Saturn here wants you to step into long-term responsibility and the kind of authority and leadership that defines your professional life. During Leo's Saturn return, he formally launched his film production company Appian Way, and he also formalized his director-actor partnership with Martin Scorsese. Through Appian Way, he was able to be both the producer and lead actor for films like The Aviator, The Revenant, The Wolf of Wall Street, and Killers of the Flower Moon. During his Saturn return in 2004, he actually got his first lead actor Oscar nomination for The Aviator, which was the first film that he produced and starred in with Martin Scorsese. And this really cemented his reputation as more than just a star. He was a serious actor working with one of the greatest directors of all time. And so it wasn't about just being famous or being a celebrity, it was about building a lasting legacy. The partnership with Martin Scorsese defined the next 2 decades of his career and has led to several Oscar nominations and wins. DiCaprio's Saturn return was about taking ownership of his career path. It forced him to grow up professionally, take on responsibility, and step into the long-term role of actor, producer, and creative leader. Saturn is the ruler of the 10th house. It's at home in the 10th house, and so it's not surprising to me that 10th house Saturn returns are a little bit easier than other Saturn returns. When I was looking through celebrities who had Saturn in the 10th house, There are a lot of them, and they're all very successful. So I feel like with a Saturn return, there's also an aspect here of where does Saturn feel the most at home? Saturn is the ruler of the 10th and sort of the 11th house, and it's also happy in the 12th house. And so I feel like these later houses, you see that the Saturn return is, at least from the outside, a lot easier than some of the earlier houses. I'll get into that more when I do final thoughts, but I just want to point it out now because I think it becomes obvious as I go through these last Saturn returns. Speaking of, let's move on to the 11th house Saturn return, and my example here is Donald Trump. The example I chose here is actually Donald Trump's second Saturn return. This is the only second Saturn return that I'm reviewing in this video. So you go through a Saturn return between the ages of 27 to 30, and that's when Saturn gets all the way back to where it was when you were born. But that happens again 27 to 30 years later when you're 56 to 60 years old. Trump had his second Saturn return in the 11th house between late 2004 to mid 2005. The 11th house rules networks, alliances, influence, and long-term aspirations. Saturn here forces you to define your place in the broader fabric of society and solidify the legacy of how you want to be seen publicly. And in Donald Trump's case, his Saturn return was definitely a win. He was unbelievably popular at this time. The Apprentice launched in early 2004, and his catchphrase, "You're fired," became a cultural phenomenon. It kind of was like the first big Trump meme. He launched a radio show, a university. He shifted from being a New York real estate mogul to being a famous household name television star.
To Saturday Night Live.
Trump, you know our wings will make you happy.
To a late-night appearance on Leno, giving Jay one of his best overall ratings of the year.
He married Melania in January 2005, and their wedding was attended by a lot of very famous and influential people. When I was researching this era of Trump for this video, it was honestly shocking to me to see how many people were attending his wedding, saying such positive things about him. I mean, like, watch this clip of him on the Ellen DeGeneres show.
Well, I'm glad to meet you, and please come back, and I think that you are an inspiration because you really do represent what everyone is trying to achieve, and to keep coming back and building more and more.
Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for being...
Like, that is so crazy to me, especially with 2025 context. He was on top of the world in 2004. So yeah, I would say the Saturn return was a major success. It solidified his networks, it expanded his influence, it kind of clarified his role in the collective. So if you're an 11th house Saturn person, maybe try the Trump approach. You fired. Okay, anyway, I'm starting to get a little delusional. We're now onto the 12th house Saturn return, the final house of the zodiac. And our example here is Barack Obama. The 12th house is a very interesting house. This is actually the house that I have my Saturn return, so if you are also a 12th house Saturn person, let me know, especially if you've already gone through your Saturn return and have some wisdom. I could use it. But the 12th house is weird because it's the house of the unseen and the hidden, so it's not easy to pin down. It's sort of like the 8th house, where it's defined by the things that aren't said or the things that are underneath the surface rather than the things that are in your face. But in general, 12th house themes are introspection, solitude, endings, and the subconscious. Saturn here forces you to withdraw, to confront hidden fears, and to restructure your inner world before stepping into a new phase of life. Barack Obama had his 12th house Saturn return in 1990. This Saturn return essentially quietly set the stage for his career in politics. In February of 1990, Barack Obama was at Harvard Law, where he was elected the first Black president of the Harvard Law Review. This was kind of his first breakthrough public moment. There was a lot of media attention for this moment, and these are like the first public interviews he ever gives. And the attention that he was receiving from the media and from the public eye was more about the importance of the moment rather than on him specifically.
Although I'm honored, and I think people can say that my election symbolizes some progress, at least within the small confines of the legal community, I think it's real important to keep the focus on the broader world out there and see that for a lot of kids, the doors that have been open to me aren't open to them.
I think that clip of him sort of shows, you know, it really was about the symbolic weight of the moment rather than about Barack Obama as an individual. This national attention is what led to his book deal for his first book, Dreams from My Father. Also interesting that there's this dream aspect too, because the 12th house has to do with dreams. Dreams from My Father was originally intended to be a book about race and law, but it ended up becoming a deeply personal memoir and kind of an exploration of self. And I feel like that really is the Saturn in the 12th house. It's about turning inward, reflecting deeply, and carrying the weight of collective responsibility. A Saturn return in the 12th house isn't so much about external achievement as it is about internal preparation. It's more about the work that you do internally and in your subconscious. Ultimately, Barack Obama's 12th house Saturn return is what prepared him for the immense role that he would go on to play in politics. So, all right, that gets through all of my examples of Saturn returns. I'm sorry if your Saturn return example was negative, but I wanted to give a full spectrum of different types of Saturn returns and how they can play out positively and negatively. My major reflection when I look at this as an astrologer is it seems like Saturn in the later houses is a lot easier than Saturn in the earlier houses. The Saturn returns that were 1 through 7 were in general a lot harder than the 8 through 12 group. I specifically think about Lana's Saturn returns, Steve Jobs, Martha Stewart, those were very difficult Saturn returns. Whereas the 10th, 11th, and 12th house Saturn returns, which were Leonardo DiCaprio, Donald Trump, and Barack Obama, those were not so bad. And I feel like this kind of makes sense because Saturn is at home in the 10th and 11th house. Saturn rules the 10th house. That's where it's happy. It's about legacy building and career, right? It's also happy in the 12th house as well. And so I feel like there's some aspect of maturity because the houses, and I could make a whole separate video just on the houses, but the houses basically tell a story of a human life. The first house is about initial identity. It's kind of like birth or coming into yourself as an individual person. And then you go through the story of life. You discover the physical world around you. You learn how to connect to your siblings. You learn about your legacy and your home and your parents. You find self-expression. You learn how to put in boring day-to-day work and perfect that self-expression. Then you meet someone, you fall in love, you realize all the power dynamics that cause problems in there. Then you have this whole dark night of the soul where you realize your philosophy, and then you channel that into your career, and then you find people that you relate to on this deeper, more expansive level, and then you die. And that's kind of the story of the houses. And so I feel like Saturn in general is a lot happier in the later houses than he is in the earlier houses because there's just not the maturity of the themes in the earlier houses. It's not to say you can't have a successful or easy Saturn return in the earlier houses. I mean, Bill Gates in the 5th house is a great example of a successful Saturn return, but I just think there's something about the maturity of the themes in the later houses that just speaks to Saturn a little bit better. Another thing I want to say after reflecting about all these Saturn returns is that it's not really possible to win your Saturn return. Yes, some are easier than others. Yes, some result in better outcomes than others. But in all cases, Saturn kind of forces you to grow up and it sort of forces you to suffer. I think the real question is how hard do you want to fight and kind of force yourself into unnecessary suffering versus just doing the work that Saturn asks you to do. So hopefully this was helpful. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this whole way through, let me know in the comments where Saturn is, or if you've gone through your Saturn return, what your experience was. I'm going to try to make videos here monthly, something like that. I don't know. We'll see. This was honestly such a drama getting even like all this stuff set up. I don't know how YouTubers do this, but I want to be making more long form astrology content. So let me know what you'd like to see. I have some ideas, but I always appreciate knowing what people want to hear about. Good luck with your Saturn return if you're going through it now or if it's upcoming. If you've been through it, let me know how it was. All right, thank you so much for watching. Talk to you later. Bye.